disaster. The deep state definitely has it out for me. You would not believe what I just made it through in the last couple of minutes. John Zamirak is going to join me. He had a little bit of an emergency with some pets that are very dear to him. But this is the Big Brown Gadfly, where we give people a hard time who need to be given a hard time. And I'm really happy to have Tracy Shannon from Mass Resistance Texas here joining me. I want to make a couple quick announcements that are worth noting. First of all, you can join our discussion group online at the location here, www.gatekeepers.online/group/the-big-brown-gadfly/discussions. But with that, I will save the rest of the announcements for later because we had so many glitches. I'm just going to get right into this. Tracy, tell us a little bit about what it looks like for Texas. The reason why I want Tracy to be able to join us tonight is because we've heard a lot about the future of the GOP and how conservatism is in flux and how everything is in conflict right now. But I think it's really important to remember that a lot of what the GOP does and a lot of what the conservative political fight is local. And that's where Tracy really has a lot of experience, and I think she's really key there. What is Mass Resistance Texas's plans for this session? And now the reason why we're focusing on Texas is because Texas is a somewhat unusual state. It only has one working session for basically 6 months every 2 years. So every time they have an open session, which is happening right now, it's a mad scramble and everyone's trying to get their bills in. And so I'm really curious to hear what Mass Resistance Texas plans to do with the session that's upcoming. What are your top priorities right now, Tracy?
So the number one top priority is the Save James bill. That would be a bill that would stop the transgender transition treatments on minor children. And two bills have been introduced so far that are in that vein. And that's House Bill 68 by Steve Toth and House Bill 1399 by Matt Krause. And we still need to get a bill in the Senate, so Mass Resistance and hopefully other groups that are also working on this are contacting senators in Texas and trying to get someone to take up legislation similar to the Alabama bill, which has many findings in it. So that's a very good bill. So that's one priority, and we've come up with several others because that would address issues that threaten religious liberty and that are pro-family and protect our rights that would protect our rights in Texas from some of these things that are coming down nationally. And we can, I think you have the list. We can kind of run through those during the show. I don't want to go over all like 16 of those, but the strategy is to, do similar to what the other side does and really bombard with several bills. And we may not get any of those passed this session because in this session being so short and once every 2 years, there's a lot of bills introduced. I think last time it was 1,800 and only 800 bills were signed. But, when you think about it as a citizen, 800 new laws, that sounds like a lot. So we kind of want this inefficiency, but when it comes to really the big priorities and getting pro-family legislation passed, that's where we really need grassroots efforts, and we need all people who are passionate about family and faith to get on board and help with these measures that will protect our parental rights, protect our children and our family.
Right. I think that one point that I want to note here is that we hear a lot about this nationwide feeling among conservatives that we've been betrayed by our leaders, that the Republican Party betrayed us, that they engaged in dirty deals that we never could have imagined. And one thing that Mass Resistance Texas can attest to is that social conservatives have experienced this already. We've experienced this in several waves. We've gone through periods where there were people who won elections and who raised billions of dollars off of saying that they were going to fight abortion. And there were so many different ways that that could be turned into betrayal. Sometimes what they would do is they would say, we're going to fight for pro-life, but then they would kind of nickel and dime it, and they would say, well, you know what, we don't want to pass anything that would seem to criminalize the mothers who are getting this, so all the legislation we have to pass has to be very, very gentle and has to work around the edges. So maybe we'll pass a heartbeat bill, or we'll pass a bill that says you have to look at the ultrasound. You know, it was all incremental, but people in the pro-life movement gradually figured out that this was going nowhere, that the people who were raising money off of the pro-life cause knew that the courts were going to strike this down. They knew that a lot of these bills were going to die in committee. They knew that even if they get passed, they were not going to last legal scrutiny, or that they were going to not even make a dent in it. And as the years went on, they got tired. And I think that the pro-life movement is even far more successful compared to the kind of causes that Tracy and I are working on in Texas. Because when you're talking about pro-family policies, for instance, trying to guarantee that children have a right to their mother and father, or one of the programs that Tracy's been talking about is trying to protect the spouses of people who come out as trans, so that their rights are not run roughshod over, or trying to make sure that sexual harassment policies are actually enforced across the board, and that a lot of sexually harassing behavior and unwelcome comments at work that are not necessary for the workplace don't fly under the radar because it's protected, because there's an LGBT element to it. That is to say, you know, if in fact sexual harassment laws are supposed to protect you from unwelcome, uncomfortable discussions about sex that don't have to do with your workplace, then a lot of these programs for inclusivity really violate that, because a lot of people are being dragged into workshops and forced to talk about sexual things that make them uncomfortable, that trigger them, and they're not relevant to the workplace. Those kinds of movements that we're fighting for are things that we have seen. I mean, the betrayal was so deep and it was so extensive. So I think what people should do with this feeling coming out of the 2020 election, like they've been betrayed and everything is just dark and dreary, and people are talking about forming a third party, the Patriot Party. Remember that these state legislatures, these city councils, these county legislatures, they're still there. They're still there begging for you to jump in and become active in. And so Shannon, or Tracy has a very good track record of being able to make a difference on these things. So in Texas, let me give people a bird's eye view of what happens in the Texas legislative sessions. We are supposedly the most red state in America. We're supposedly a rock solid Republican state. That's what you see that from the outside, right? What is the reality when you're on the inside, Tracy? When you go to Austin, which is a very liberal city, and that's where the state government is housed, when you go down there, what typically happens when you have a bill in your hand and you, like this the ban on transgender transitioning for people who are minors, what typically happens to those Republicans when you actually are there in Austin trying to get a bill passed?
Well, they're not really eager to help us, I would say. There's a lot of just really weak Republicans, unfortunately. A lot of shenanigans go on. For example, some people will make some really nice speeches and, introduce a bill, make some nice speeches on the floor, and that's really good for their campaign, but because they're probably running again. But behind the scenes, the bills are going to die. So that's why there's more needed from the grassroots effort. And also, as we saw with a bathroom bill in the past, that was basically killed because of corporate efforts and our, I think it was the Texas Chamber of Commerce that, made threats over that and scare these politicians. And we also had someone who championed a pro-family bill. I think it might have been the bathroom bill in one of the last sessions, and they received death threats and threats to their family. And so they're unlikely, to take up another bill because of that. And, we don't.
Yeah, I remember that session. There was all of this publicity because what had happened is in Shannon's city, Houston, there was a mayor who was trying to push this HERO ordinance, right? It was the Human Equality Rights Ordinance or something along those act, and this was going to bring all of the bathroom situations into bright focus, because it was going to mean that every single restroom facility in the whole city was going to have to admit essentially both sexes. And then there was a movement against that, and they were successful at stopping that. So that all happened in 2017. So when we went into the 2019 legislative session, there was all of this enthusiasm. People thought that we were going to get all of these bills to try to push back against some of the more radical trans policies. And in Texas, it didn't work. It stalled. I remember also in 2017 when Strauss was the Speaker of the House. Remember that? What he would do is he would intentionally bury things in committee, or it was what Stephen Hotze hypothesized was that there seemed to be consultation between the Republicans and the LGBT movement, because sometimes they would put forward a very weak bill and then the LGBT lobby would publicly attack it for the purpose of making us think that it was actually a significant piece of legislation, when actually it was something that was very weak, that was going to die or not actually be able to focus on anything. So one of the things that we have to do when we go to Texas this time is we've got to be able to have very strong advocates in the state legislature ready to help us when we get there. But we also have to be really shrewd about this. And, a lot of the people who were in Austin who were really good at lobbying, they very often they were good at raising money, but they weren't necessarily good at following these pieces of legislation all the way through. Now, what happened in Montana with the recent bill there, Tracy, and what does that imply for Texas, you think?
Well, I don't know the exact language of that bill, but I think we'll see a similar showdown in Texas if we do not get a really good ground game with pro-family activists and groups, and a coordinated effort. In Montana, I think there were like 26 LGBTQ groups that organized and pushed back, and so the bill, which would ban transgender treatments on children, it failed. It didn't get its third reading, and then there was a motion to reconsider, and that also failed, and so the bill is dead. And that the House there has a Republican majority, so there's no reason that should have failed, considering Republicans should be prioritizing the safeguarding children. And so this really indicates that on our side of the argument that the information isn't getting out there, because there's a growing body of evidence to support that these are harmful treatments and that they're scientifically unsound and really ideologically driven. So, in Texas, we'll probably see the same. I heard that the Chamber of Commerce there in Montana, as well as the corporate interests, were part of shutting that down. And we will probably see the same kind of pressure, because the Human Rights Campaign, for example, will be bringing that type of pressure. But, we need to have more moral courage than that. Even if your family, of course, there's going to be threats. I mean, I'm sure you receive threats. I've received threats. But we don't cave to terrorists, and that's not an excuse. Fear, smear campaigns in the media, that's not an excuse not to do the right thing and protect children.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that happens, I'm going to talk a little bit about why this goes wrong, why you have states like Idaho, like Wyoming, like Montana, like South Dakota, this great governor that everyone loves. She also did not support bills that were trying to protect women's sports from a lot of the trans athletics, et cetera. How does this happen? Well, one of the ways that it happens is that the LGBT lobby is very, very persistent. They attack us on all sides at all times, and they tend to go to these state capitals, and they have a whole slew of bills that they're going to put through, and they tend to use the element of surprise. They put things in that they know people expect never to pass, and sometimes it won't pass from year after year after year, and then all of a sudden they'll surprise us because there'll be some member on a committee who will all of a sudden get this crazy bill to go through, and then boom, it'll become law. That's one of the techniques that they use. They tend to use timing to their advantage. A lot of times our side, we try to make a big public show of the one or two things that we're going to do in a session, and that gives the other side tons and tons of time to figure out how to come up with a counter argument. The day that we have hearings, they bus in tons of people, they tell very emotionally impactful stories, and then even if our stuff does pass at the very last minute, they put in little poison pills as amendments to some of these bills so that it becomes unpalatable, and then it falls down to the last minute. And it usually comes down to the wire. That's what happens in Texas because of the fact that we only do this once every 2 years for 6 months. You get to the very end of a session, and all of a sudden, because of a whole bunch of last minute problems, none of the bills don't go through. So we're trying to keep very good track of what's happening with the transgender bill, and that's useful. That's encouraging. I'm really happy to see that that's going. I want to hear a little bit from you, Tracy, about why this matters to families. You know, I'm sure that you come across a lot of people. I came across this on Twitter the other night where I was posting about some of this, and somebody said, you know, my son is gay. It's a personal issue for me. This doesn't really matter. I just want to focus on the most important things about the conservative agenda, and we're just going to have to let this go. Why would you say that we can't let some of these issues go?
Well, because as I saw firsthand many years ago, this is something that will ultimately affect every household and every member of society. Some people may not know, or if you've watched the show before, you know that my family was personally affected by the transgender movement. I'm divorced from a man who transitioned whenever we were married, and we had 3 kids together. During that time, I was able to see the teeth of this movement, you know, how it affects the psychological community, and in the legal atmosphere when I was going through my divorce. So it will ultimately affect your parental rights, and we're seeing that come to fruition. I warned about that many years ago, over a decade ago, and it is now happening. We see James Younger, 8-year-old boy, whose father is essentially being removed from the situation and making decisions about his own son's medical care. He doesn't want his son to be transitioned. And there have been other cases like this around the United States. There are 500 children, at least in Texas, currently in gender clinics where there's only an affirmation only model, which means the children are going to be affirmed. You go in there and say that the child plays with, is a girl but plays with boy toys, likes to wear boy clothes. Okay, this child is transgender. They put the child on the transgender medical pathway, suppressing puberty with puberty blockers. Puberty is not a disease, and it should not be suppressed, and except for in the case of precocious puberty. But these children are having their puberty suppressed, and it's not reversible. This is completely uncharted territory and medical experimentation on children that's ideologically driven. So, you know, some of the things that I saw when I went through divorce court and family court was that, you know, I was questioned over my own beliefs and how I could co-parent with a transgender parent because I'm Christian and because I'm conservative. I was also, every day, we had to sit through the lawyers arguing about if I was going to use the preferred pronouns and the new legal name that my spouse had taken on in the prioritize even divorcing. And that is emotional battery of a spouse who's divorcing a transgender.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing that I'm really eager to try to test a different approach or a different theory here, which is that a lot of the things that we are objecting to about this agenda, the LGBT agenda, are not necessarily direct objections to LGBT people. They are focused on the specific harms that the movement causes. And what we find is there are existing laws that are supposed to protect Americans from some of these harms. There are sexual harassment laws. There are sexual predator laws. There are laws against grooming. There are laws against harassment, against stalking. There are laws against bad counseling and bad mentorship that causes people to make decisions about their life that are actually counterproductive or harmful. There are laws about fraud and misrepresenting research, etc. But what happens is, because LGBT is a protected group and because their identity as a protected group is based on their behavior, they actually are protected from a lot of the laws that are supposed to stop them from engaging in these things. And so harassment is one of the best examples I can think of. Across the country, harassment law is very clear in schools and in workplaces. And the test is, if you have unwelcome discussions of a sexual nature that make people uncomfortable, and it's not necessary given what the primary function of that workplace or school is, then you have to give priority to the person who feels uncomfortable. And it's a subjective test. It's not an objective test. So you can't say, well, the purpose of this workshop that I forced all of my workers to go to, where they were forced to listen to a sex worker talk about being trans and showing them all their sex toys, etc. You can't say, well, my intent was to be educational, right? According to standard sexual harassment law at the workplace, you have to go by the standard of that person who went there felt uncomfortable, and that takes precedence. And sexual harassment law also says that if somebody objects to these discussions, or they resist them, or they complain about them, you cannot engage in retaliation against them. Right? But what happens, I don't know if you have examples, Shannon, but I've seen this across the country where in schools and in workplaces, people are forced into these discussions under the name of inclusivity and being welcoming and opening. Sometimes you have people who have survived sex abuse. I know of cases of people who have survived same-sex sex abuse, and they don't want to be dragged into a workshop and forced to talk about very sensitive sexual discussion. They don't want to open the door for everyone in the office or everyone in the school to be questioning your sexuality, your sexual behavior. They don't want to be laid open to being hit on and groomed or whatever by people in this sexual manner, and they're uncomfortable. But a lot of times, if they file a complaint or if they say they don't like it, they are brought up on charges. So retaliation is not just permitted, it's actually institutionalized. The person who complains about it all of a sudden becomes the problem. And that affects people's jobs, it affects people's schools. It really is a huge issue for the middle and working class, because it is something that's going to have economic impact, and I think it's something that that we should take seriously, especially if we're going to be following in the Donald Trump era and we're going to be looking at working class conservatism. This is a workplace issue. And it is an issue where the left wing has really abandoned their principles because they're letting this go on and they're protecting it in order to stay in good with that lobby. Do you see what I'm saying, Tracy? Do you have examples that you've talked to of people who these kinds of discussions and these interactions are forced on them, and it's unwelcome, it's discomforting, and it's unnecessary for the mission of the organization, but no sexual harassment rules seem to be put into place to protect people from it?
Well, not only is this happening in corporate America, but also in our schools. And school teachers are employees, and we know that we have a lot of school teachers who probably do not necessarily agree with the type of training that they're having to sit through. And if they don't sit through it, they're going to be blacklisted, maybe even lose their job. And they don't want to pass some of these things on to students either. You see the pride celebrations in school. And I think that's another example of, coercion and possibly even sexual harassment with some of the sex ed stuff that's taught to children now, which is extremely inappropriate. And but there's an obscenity exemption in Texas for education and scientific teaching. So that needs to be removed as it pertains to children. We would not tolerate somebody in a public park coming up to our children, starting to talk to them about sex toys, BDSM, and pornographic videos. But we allow this to happen in our public schools under the, guise of education, and that's not education. Now, I do know in our military, I've talked to mothers whose children go in the military, they're boys and or young men. And so imagine your 18-year-old goes off to serve his country, and while there receives diversity training, these are young people, even though they are adults and can make decisions for themselves, usually are, have still some insecurities, don't know where they're headed in life, may have some baggage they haven't unpacked, from childhood, and they are being subjected to this diversity training. And some of these kids come home and tell their parents, these men come home and tell their parents, I'm a woman now, and I'm getting my sex change in the military. And, and taxpayers are paying for this. And, Donald Trump had the right idea, and Biden just reversed that. We shouldn't be paying for sex changes. We shouldn't be having people who are in the military who can't do the job that they were enlisted for because they have, so many medical things going on with transitioning and mental things going on.
Right.
So,
well, I think that it's, my time in the military was brief, but when I was in the Army Reserves, I thought that this was an issue that did not get properly addressed. There were so many rules about male-female interaction and any discussion of a sexual nature when you were around men and women. So, for instance, when I was in there, a man and a woman could not be sitting on the same piece of furniture ever. You always, it was that much of a strict environment. But as they were loosening the rules surrounding Don't Ask, Don't Tell, all of a sudden we were encouraged to have open discussions about people's sexuality in this highly pressurized, cramped environment. And it felt uncomfortable, and it does affect unit cohesion. It does affect the way people feel. And the sexual assault rate did increase among, between people of the same sex after that was brought in. And it's so in conflict with everything that we have been talking about for the last 5 years about Me Too and sexual harassment and sexual abuse. That's the thing that is just really gets me. And I know that there are cases where people suffer from sex abuse, but because it's same-sex sex abuse, it's a lot more difficult to get justice in the system. People are afraid to really prosecute this. The gay community very often closes ranks, and when there is someone who has been victimized by someone in that community, they say that the person is really gay and closeted, and they're making it up, and they're crazy, and they do all those things that abusers do to cover up someone in their community who's been caught engaging in abuse. That's how a lot of this plays out on a personal level. For me, for instance, I was abused at the age of 13 by other teenage boys. And so, there's no way that I could ever get justice on that. I was drunk. I shouldn't have been drunk at 13. They shouldn't have been drunk at the age that they were. But that happened, and that affected me for decades afterwards. It really did. It followed me along for decades. But there would be no way for me to go back and to fix it. And now that's happening to so many people. There's no way for them to go back and to get justice for what happened to them. You think of all of the kids who are in school or at camp or in some institutional environment, and there's someone who's in a counseling or ministerial or discipleship position over them, and they tell them, oh, you must be gay or you must be trans. I can tell because of the way you throw this ball, or I can tell by the way that you talk with your hands, or you like playing with flowers, or if you're talking to a girl, your habits are not typically feminine. And they advise them, and it's not even just advisement, it's also a lot of pressure. Wouldn't you say that, Tracy, that you see a lot of cases where there's pressure applied? And if it turns out to be a terrible decision for them, and if it turns out that the research on which this counselor was basing their advice turns out to have been fake, people can't go back and sue their counselors for malfeasance. What do you think would be a solution for that situation, Shannon?
Well, I think that experts who give testimony and policy is being based on their testimony, and it's faulty research or research that is of low quality, that really doesn't stand up to community standards. Maybe that's not the right word, because the scientific community seems to be going more towards consensus instead of evidence. But it needs to be evidence-based, not just self-reporting. Like we see a lot of self-reporting, kind of really surveys, and some of them not even statistically significant surveys. You have to have a sample that is accurate and
diverse and representative, and the people can't know what the purpose of the research is.
Gender center, by the way, where everyone's kind of in a euphoric state from recently transitioning, and you need to follow people further into life, and we don't have studies like that because we lose those people. And you need to have the right number. Sometimes we'll see, a small sample, and you have to have a statistically valid sample. And unfortunately, our public is just so ignorant of, of statistics. We're so uneducated and so indoctrinated, and you wrote a good piece earlier this week in the American Thinker about rhetoric versus evidence. And it was spot on. I mean, you hear all the time the rhetoric repeated, in the media, and you hear it repeated by activists. And then you have your politicians who make policy who are you're repeating the same thing. And we cannot be making policy based on rhetoric, because policy affects the culture.
Right. And a lot of times there are existing laws or legal principles that we can turn to. We have a body of established law, established policy guidelines, or best standards and practices in different disciplines and fields, but we completely ignore them when it comes to the LGBT issue, and that's what always amazes me. That, for instance, the research is a really good example. There are disciplinary standards in the fields of biology and psychiatry, in the field of biogenetics, in the field of counseling, social work, psychology, all of those fields, even literature and art and music, they have disciplinary standards. And very often when they do research into LGBT matters, number one, a lot of the journals that publish this research, they are afraid of the pressure that will come on them if they publish any findings that go counter to them. This is how the born gay myth was perpetuated for so long, because they could never prove in any kind of controlled experiment or any kind of study that there were genetic causes for homosexuality. They looked and looked and looked. I remember Simon LeVay and the brain study, and that was a crazy one. I don't know if you remember that one. That was way back in 1992. Simon LeVay found that the hypothalamus in gay men was smaller, the part of the brain was smaller in gay men than in straight men. And I said to myself, okay, do we really want to be basing this on the idea that gay men have smaller brains? I don't know if that's really progress for the gay community, but it turned out, of course, that this was not genetically significant at all, because it was the people who had the brain of the gay men's brains belongs to men who had AIDS. And so AIDS had affected the protein in that part of their brain. Anyways, they've tried and tried and tried to find a genetic cause. And finally, there was a study where they did they studied the genome of hundreds of thousands of people, and they basically said, look, people are not born gay, let's put this to rest. But you will not see that myth die, and you still see people putting out studies with the assumption that the gay population is a genetically or biologically distinct group of people, as if their identity comes from some kind of biological factor. And that affects all of the conclusions and all of the hypotheses that are put forward, but yet nobody will ever challenge it, because you will get the treatment that was received, for instance, by Paul McHugh in Johns Hopkins, when he basically said that he had studied all the transgender studies and none of it was valid research. The Human Rights Campaign tried to get him fired. They tried to get Johns Hopkins sanctioned because that was where he was working. So they went after his employer, they went after his friends, and then they'll go after your family. They'll get all of your publications retracted. So I do think that when we look at this and you look at things like the research, I do want to see state legislatures take the lead on starting to say that if you present research that is faulty, and you do that in the context of trying to push for policies that have the potential to harm people, I think that there should be a penalty assigned to that. But in order to have that kind of legislation put through, there has to be a state somewhere that has legislators who are willing to try something new, who are willing to take the lead on something. But I think this is a huge issue because sometimes the issue is so vast that social conservatives just don't know where to start. So Tracy, what's the value, do you think, of taking on the whole ensemble of it, but trying to at least break it down into specific areas so they're manageable? Is there a value to that, you think?
Yeah, I think for any battle, you have to have a strategy. And
right.
So what we're talking about is having a bigger strategy, not just being reactive to whatever is the latest
I
thing.
think her stream might be breaking down.
Can you hear me? No, you're frozen. Oh. Okay, it looks like we lost the host. Maybe he'll be back. So we're talking about having a larger strategy for going after the LGBTQ movement and stopping some of their progress that they've been making, because their progress actually is progress in chipping away at our individual rights, as far as parental rights and our freedom of speech. And it's even affecting our workplaces. It's affecting where we go to school, where our kids go to school. Hello? Oh, okay. I'll just start talking. Okay, all right, thanks. All right, bye. Sorry. Okay, sorry. I kind of thought that I was the one that got kicked out of the show, but I guess there's an internet issue over on Bobby's end. So I'm going to just kind of run down some of the legislative priorities that mass resistance will be working on this session and in future sessions, and not just in Texas, hopefully. So, so what we were just talking about is the dissemination of fake research. Oh, hi, Bobby.
Hello. Okay. I honestly think the devil or some activist just gets in here and breaks the signal because it only happens with certain guests.
So I was just closing windows and.
Were you able to talk through that little brief interlude, or
a big quiet period? Because I eventually thought, well, maybe I'm the one that was kicked out of here. And
right?
I was closing windows and about to leave and come back, and then Arthur called me, so I'm on here live talking to Arthur.
Okay, I don't know what to do. It's too bad.
Strange.
Well, you know what I've got to do. We recently had a wedding anniversary, and my wife was like, I said to my wife, because we just finished 20 years of marriage, and I said, what you've got to do is we have to get a better internet, because I really like doing these live streams, but it is such a disaster. I mean, tonight was a disaster. I'll just chalk it all up to a crazy experience. But I think that the larger point that we made was good. And then, of course, John Zamirak couldn't make it, so he was trying really hard to get there, but he couldn't get up there. Let me see if I can get Arthur in on here. And I should have warned you that if the signal broke off, that it was going to go kind of crazy. Can you tell me a little bit more about this whole idea of trying to protect the spouses? How does that work in terms of protecting what you call trans widows?
Yes, so trans widows are the partners of spouses who are transitioning and they're going through a divorce. And what's needed here to protect trans widows like myself, and in some cases, I guess, trans widowers, we need to be protected while we're going through the legal process of divorce. And what I'm looking for is a press pause. And this is something that's been advocated for in the UK, and I think that is actually getting some wheels there, if not already passed. And this would allow someone like myself, when I was getting divorced, to pause or require a pause to the legal transition. I'm not sure about pausing the medical, but it is really unethical to be unaware of your spouse's, for a doctor to be medically transitioning someone who's married without the knowledge or consent of their wife, which that happened to me. I actually even went, and we just lost Bobby, but okay, I'll keep talking. Hi,
hey.
We actually went to therapy with a therapist, and so she knew that I was not aware that my ex was going to be taking hormones, and she wrote a letter to him, and the hormones were prescribed for him for 11 years without my knowledge, and that should not happen. But the press pause doesn't even address that. It addresses the legal part, going to court and having a name change, having your gender identifier on your driver's license or any other legal documents changed prior to going through the divorce process, because then the person who's already going through an emotional hard time with the divorce and their spouse of many years who they may have children with, like I did, is transitioning and you're divorcing, but then you go to court and you get battered with, you've got to use pronouns that they prefer, or you're going to be held in contempt, or and fined, maybe even jailed, because, and this is, like you said, there are laws that exist. The government cannot compel speech, but the LGBTQ radical lawyers, every day of my trial, try to fight to make me use those pronouns, and like Mrs. and the new legal name. And that is emotional battery to the spouses. And so what's needed here is that at the very least is a press pause or expediting of the divorce process, because you can handle all the other issues of divorce, like property, but you can nullify the marriage quickly. You can also do the custody battle separately, but a woman like myself shouldn't have to go to court and be basically made into a paper lesbian. And I will say that, speaking of unethical conduct by counselors, the therapist that we went to actually told me that I'm a lesbian. Now, I think I would be, when it comes to the LGBTQ, self-identification, self-reporting is, they're all really big at that. But I wasn't allowed to say what my own sexual identity is. This doctor was going to tell me that I'm a lesbian because I actually was married to someone who was cross-dressing, had a fetish, and ultimately decided, much later, decided to transition.
Yeah, I noticed that a lot of times people just act as though it's no big deal when the LGBT lobby does these things. They think that it's not that bad to be told you're a lesbian when you're not, or it's not that bad to have to be like, for me when I was in college, to be 21 years old and to have everyone in the gay club gossiping about the fact that you're supposedly gay and stalking you all over the place. For some reason, they act as though this isn't the same thing. It's not as bad as when men do this to women, or this is done in a heterosexual context. It's somehow there's this magical dust that settles in over everything when the LGBT lobby is involved, and somehow that isn't incredibly traumatic to happen as you are also losing a husband, which to me is, it's just, you shouldn't have to go through that emotional abuse. I guess Arthur can join us too and can kind of help us to talk a little bit about what some of the efforts are in other states to address a lot of these issues. Because honestly, a lot of the conservative bills that have been suggested in state legislatures, they haven't addressed a lot of these side issues. So I'm wondering from Arthur, how can we get some of these other approaches or these other issues to be reflected in the proposed legislation at the state level, so that we can move? And it's important to do the stuff about the girls' sports. It's important to do the stuff about the bathrooms. But what about all this other stuff about the harassment, about the violation of labor laws, the abuse of people in the family court process? How do we get that ball rolling?
I agree with all of these reforms. And I think just submitting the legislation in and of itself is essential, because it makes this a prominent story to the public. People don't understand the suffering and the pain that trans widows or widowers suffer with, and that the children endure as well. I'm very committed to helping Texas Mass Resistance with getting these bills submitted. Times really, in some legislatures, the window of time to submit legislation, it's closing really fast. So the sooner I can have that, the better. I'm going to be working with Tracy and also with you, Bobby. I think these are great ideas. I can tell you right now, just to give you a window into the challenges we're facing in Montana, we've been working really hard, not just with keeping the boys out of girls' sports, but we've been working to try to ban transgender surgeries on minors. And you'd think that would be a common sense no-brainer. The bill failed yesterday in the Montana state legislature. I mean, this is just shocking. Montana, a deep red rural state, they have a supermajority of Republicans, and 19 Republicans caved because they got all of this gobbledygook and all of this left-wing propaganda from universities, LGBT activists, and the Chamber of Commerce got involved. And they put pressure on the leadership to kill the bill. I mean, this is horrific. And Tracy was telling me yesterday about how transgenderism, homosexuality, and all the ideologies underneath it are big money. And there's a lot of profit that unscrupulous, perverted quacks and their corporate backers make off of butchering children's bodies. And if we're facing this kind of a challenge just to protect kids, I mean, it's unprecedented what we're going to be facing to protect widows, the orphans in these families, and to ensure that there's liabilities imposed on the homosexual and transgender activists when they harass students, when they harass adults. You know, homosexual privilege is just rife in academia, it's rife in government, and we have to start pushing back on it. Bobby, I know that's the idea you have submitted, to hold them accountable to these public accommodation laws, and I agree with it. I think it's a great idea, specifically to start holding academic institutions accountable when they are submitting doctored, distorted, or just plain false scholarship to make these brazenly unsubstantiated assertions that people are born gay, or that there's a genetic component, or that gay couples are more stable and they raise healthier children. All of this has been systematically debunked by real research. And this is especially true considering what's happening in Montana. The bill and bills in other states too, they are including liability provisions that once a kid, if they grow up and they want to go back to being comfortable with their birth sex, that there's an opening for liability. And we know the business community, or big business and big pharma, does not want that. So this is the fight that's on our hands. But mass resistance is aware of it, and we're facing it. We're confronting it fully.
Yeah, the liability part is really good. One of the other fake research statistics that they always bring up during these hearings is they always say that kids are going to kill themselves if all of these things don't happen. They say the suicide rate is going to go up if we don't legalize gay adoption, or which is crazy, because it's you're on the one hand, the activists are saying that their community has a serious suicidal ideation problem, at the same time that they're saying, give us kids. You know what I mean? It conflicts with each other, but for instance, Tracy, don't they always say that, unless they're allowed to go in the bathroom and see the opposite sex naked, that they're going to kill themselves, and that anyone who stops them is guilty of killing them, as if, just somebody wanting to have privacy means that you want to murder somebody else. And it almost seems like it follows the pattern of basic domestic violence, where people threaten self-harm as a way of controlling other people, right?
It's a form of bullying. I mean, I would go as far as to say, even some of the parents who have kids who are confused and who are being diagnosed as transgender, wrongfully diagnosed as transgender, are bullied with this statistic about suicides. But that we see all these transgender activists go into the Capitol, go into our city halls and speak and talk about the statistic, and they stand there very much alive. So if they made it through childhood without transitioning, and they transitioned as an adult, how can they stand there and say that that these children are going to die if they can't transition as minors? I mean, we used to have watchful waiting, and watchful waiting results in the children, by the time they're like 20 years old and they've gone through puberty, more than 80% desist. That means they become comfortable living in their biological sex instead of going through all this lifetime of modification, surgeries, secrecy, counseling forever, hormones forever, and all the high risk that come with all of that, not just medical, but the social risk. And those are not because people like us speak out against transitioning minors and that we want to protect children, or even that we speak truth about LGBTQ behaviors. We have grown more accepting in our society of LGBTQ, yet they're still reporting this high level of suicidality. So if that's the case, you need to stop pointing the finger outward and start pointing it towards themselves.
I hope you don't mind me jumping in. I can't stress this enough. We have seen growing LGBT acceptance in Western countries, and the suicide rates are skyrocketing. It's getting worse. You know, they've been given everything that they've bullied and begged and demanded, and yet the suicide rates, the homicide rates, the self-harm has increased. So, I mean, that ought to say something. There's a problem with the behaviors. There's a problem with the ideology. The problem isn't society, it's them. Yeah.
Well, or at the very least, that the community that people are being initiated into has problems that they have to look at. They have to seriously examine. They have to examine themselves. I wanted to thank both of you, and I wanted to give you a very deep apology about all of the internet failures that have gone on. I have got to get a better internet connection. This hopefully this will, and I'm still suspicious that somebody is breaking the signal. This is my paranoid, but maybe not so paranoid, maybe just my realistic thing about it. But I think that Shannon is Tracy. I keep on calling you Shannon when your name is Tracy, and it's just because I'm a little bit discombobulated with all the internet problems. But your name is Tracy. So Tracy, what can we look forward to with Mass Resistance Texas? Are we going to have trips to Austin? Are we going to have press conferences? How can people get involved? How can people jump in?
So you can follow us on our social media. I encourage people to sign up at www.massresistance.org to get our emails and get on our contact list. We will, and on Twitter, Mass Resistance Texas is @mass_TX. And also Mass Resistance has its main account @Mass Resistance on Twitter. There's several accounts on, depending what city you live in Texas. There's also the main Mass Resistance Texas account on Facebook. We will be making trips to Austin when it's effective to do so, and we will be having some press conferences and press releases going out about these bills that we want to be working on. So people can look forward to that. We want to light up all of our networks. We're going to get all of our friends, all of our connections, working together to do this, just like the other side does, and push back on these harmful agenda coming down on us. Because locally, what you do matters. We can press back against the harmful agenda coming down from DC.
All right, thank you very much. Arthur, what else is going on with Mass Resistance nationwide?
So we have chapters building in Colorado, Texas, obviously. We are building stuff in Montana, Idaho, Utah. Very excited about Utah. Things are looking really positive. There is a bill to ban transgender surgeries on kids there. This is the second year they've tried to do it, so that's usually a good sign. A new sponsor is bringing the bill forward. We have stuff going on in Massachusetts. Can you believe it? Mass Resistance, we're based in Massachusetts, but we haven't had a really strong chapter. We've got some great leadership. We have people in the military. We have retired and active clergy who are now helping us in Massachusetts to stand up to this filth. It'll be the second shot heard around the world. I invite everyone who's listening, you can contact me. My work cell, I'm not afraid to share it, 781-474-3005, 781-474-3005, and my email address is arthur@massresistance.org, arthur@massresistance.org. Thank you so much, Bobby, for having me on.
Thank you very much. We'll see you soon.